Hi, and welcome to Healing Solidarity, Embodying Change, the second conference about reimagining international development. And I'm Marianne Clements, a feminist writer, facilitator, activist, and coach, and I'm the initiator of Healing Solidarity. In this conversation, I talk with Mary Jane Rial about her work with Urgent Action Fund Asia and Pacific, how the fund has conceptualized embodying their values in their own practice, how they think about the well-being of themselves and the groups they fund, and the challenges in really embodying our values and walking our talk in the work that we do. It's a really interesting conversation, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I enjoyed having it with Mary Jane. So enjoy. So hi, and I'm here with Mary Jane Rial, who's the co-lead for Urgent Action Fund for Women's Human Rights for Asia and Pacific. And she's talking to me from Cambodia, I think, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
from Siem Reap, Cambodia, yes.
Welcome to Healing Solidarity. So I wanted to ask you just to say a bit about yourself and your work, just as an introduction for people listening. And then we'll move in a bit more to the topic we want to talk about. But yeah, just introduce us to you and your work.
Yeah. So I'm based in the Philippines and lived there most of my life. And I basically caught the tail end of the martial law in the Philippines. So when it happened, it was at the university. So as I always say, I became an activist by circumstance, because at the time, it's really not a choice whether you want to be an activist or not. I mean, political repression was happening, and it's just morally and politically the right thing to do to resist it. And so, in a sense, I think I was fortunate that I was in that political moment, and it was my political awakening as well. So I've been an activist since then, and eventually gravitated towards women's human rights, and then embraced feminism as my living paradigm, and continued to work in the women's rights movements ever since. So I've been a women's rights activist for a long time.
Yeah, great. And maybe if you could tell us a little bit about Urgent Action Fund for people that don't know about you and your work.
Yeah, so Urgent Action Fund was started way back. So the funds were geared towards addressing the issues that they deal with, in terms of funding for advocacy, for lobbying, for capacity building, but not necessarily for the needs of the activists. So Urgent Action Fund aimed to respond to the needs of the activists themselves. And ever since, it has focused on funding women, and eventually have embraced also including the non-binary or LGBTIQ communities. So now we basically cater to the needs of women and non-binary defenders worldwide, in the sense that UAF has 4 sister funds, and we're just one of them. So there's one that's based in the US that handles the other global the other regions, such as MENA, which is the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and the other regions. And then we have a Latin American and an African fund, and we're the latest addition. So we were just launched in 2017. We started our full operations the year after, in 2018, for the Asia and the Pacific.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that background. So thinking about how, you're about supporting activists, you wanted to talk a bit about how you embody the change that you want to see in the world and how you practice it in your work. So if you might want to reflect on how you do your work in a way that's supporting activists, not just giving support to other activists, but also supporting yourselves and the fund as you do it.
So when we started UAF Asia and the Pacific, we many of us who were at the core of setting it up have been in the movements for some time, have been part of institutions and running them. So we have sort of both an overview and an experiential knowledge of what it is to create an organization. And we were all saying we wanted to do things differently, in the sense that what we've experienced before have led some of us to burnouts, and eventually question the sustainability of how we do our work. So we said we wanted to do things differently. So right from the start, when we were trying to set up how the leadership would be for UAF Asia and the Pacific, um, we I was very clear that if I was going to do it, I didn't want to do it on myself by myself, because I've run a network of organizations before. Asia Pacific Women Law and Development, an organization of, at the time, 150
Mm-hmm.
organizational members, and doing it on your own, wherein you basically have to do the fundraising, you have to do the political representation, you have to manage the staff and the operations, all of that you have to do on your own, and it was just too backbreaking, literally. So I said, if I'm going to do it again, I don't want to do it ever on my own. So, and I think we were also set up when there's already been experiments around co-leadership, and therefore it was easy for us to just say, why don't we try out that leadership model instead of just going with what we have, what have been the practice before of just having one executive director in an organization. And it also worked because we're doing both Asia and the Pacific, which are two regions instead of one. And so having a co-lead from the Pacific and co-lead, and I'm working with the Asian region, then makes sense to have two co-leads as well. And then Viri, who's Wadromo, is my co-lead now. She's basically also run an organization before, so she had the same mindset as I had, that there's no way we can do institution building on our own. Yeah. So we were both in sync in thinking, and then also we clearly defined our areas of work. So she's basically chosen to work on resource mobilization and fundraising, and then I work on the program. So when I try to put it simply, it's like she raises the money and I spend it, but I think it's a good way to share the critical responsibilities of doing this work. I mean, fundraising on its own is huge work, and so is program development. So having them split into two different roles then makes sense for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And how has that working together been working? Like, are there challenges with it? Does it flow very easily? Because I think it's interesting for people to think about as well. Like, what do I need to bear in mind if I'm going to pursue co-leadership as a strategy?
Yeah. So what worked for us is basically clarity of the division of labor, and the decision making that are related to it. So, and on matters on fundraising, she consults me, but she has the final say on those matters, because she's taking the lead for it. The same way for programs, then I consult her, but I also have the final decision to do that. And then therefore we're clear about not passing it back and forth, between us in terms of who makes the decision on what. So that's one. The second is basically we had a collegial, and we were friends even before we became co-leads. So for me, I mean, having that bond before we work together helps facilitate many of the communication, precisely because we're virtual, and so it's so difficult to build trust, to build a relationship in a virtual context. So having that before we became co-leads is an advantage, I think. The challenges, of course, is again also related to being in a virtual space, because that means that we have to continually try to schedule consultations or talking with each other to try to time these consultations so that the decisions are made in a timely manner, which then sometimes they're not. And therefore that becomes difficult in that sense.
I was thinking about what you wanted, which was not to do it on your own. Does it feel like you're doing it together, and does you feel that support, and what are the positives, I guess, is interesting too.
Yeah. So I definitely I feel like it's a shared and a joint responsibility instead of having to bear it all on my own. I remember quite clearly that I cannot yet write yet another funding proposal,
Yeah.
for example. So
Yeah.
just having someone to share that burden with is already a big, relief for me. But one of the things that I also value about it is just having someone who is at the same level, shares the same responsibility, but that I'm able to bounce ideas with and think through the decisions. So, it's having a co-equal thinking with you about the decisions that you have to make for the organization. For me, that's a valuable advantage for having a co-lead, instead of having to think about many of these things of my own and bearing the burden solely of those decisions on my shoulders. So that's important for me.
Yeah. And when you're working with the rest of the organization, how are you trying to kind of embody that support and way, maybe feminist approaches to how you kind of support the rest of the people you're working with?
Yeah, so we're actually thinking about it in the sense that we have chosen a co-leadership model, but we haven't really thought through in terms of structurally and process-wise, how would it actually flow into how we organize and manage the team and restructure the organization. And I think that's one big work that we're hoping to do in the next few years, because then it has impact in terms of how we arrange decision making with the different team members that we supervise, because we also have split who's supervising whom among the team, for example. So we have to work that through. But one of the things that we're trying to embody the change that we want to see in the world is, when we were thinking about our monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning system, or our meal system, we said we didn't want to just default into a lag frame or the existing results-based management systems of tracking change. So we've adopted emergent learning as our framework, which is basically centered into developing benchmarks and processes that guides us to learn more and not necessarily just monitor and evaluate programs and their results. So in that way, we then formulate what we call them learning questions. And we have a learning question that's internal to the organization. Yeah, so basically, so the way that we're trying to see how we try to embody the change that we want to see out there in terms of the activist and social movements is, we've adopted a learning question for the organization, an internal one, which is what would it take to practice a feminist culture of giving and sharing in the organization? So that's our learning question as a team. And that's basically what we will try to reflect upon in our retreat, which will start tomorrow. So we've adapted the questions. We developed our monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning system last January. And then we tried to particularize it in terms of how we will track the processes and the practices related to it, and then have reflection moments as well, so that then we're guided by the learning question as we try to internalize and embody the change we want to see in the social movements. Yeah.
No, continue.
No, I mean, you have a question, I can answer it.
I was just interested in knowing more about how you use those learning questions as an alternative to kind of log frames or other traditional methods of monitoring. So you're holding the question basically as you reflect on how your work's going, right?
Exactly. So for us, for example, so we all have periodic reflections on the question. First, we try to put in practices that we want to adapt within the organization to respond to that question. And also we have periodic reflection sessions in terms of how we make those progress. So it's so new in the sense that we just started developing this in January, and it's just October now. But I think it's a good start in the sense that we're very intentional that we want to put it as part of how we track change, that it's not just about social change externally, but also looking at internal change within the organization. So, for example, making sure that we have structured is that we have the conventional health insurance that's offered by different insurance agencies, but also leave some amount of money within that budget for each one to be able to cover other health needs that are not uh, um, covered by the insurance. So it includes being able to have eye checkups, for example, which is not covered in some of the insurance uh, policies. Or for myself, having an acupuncture for my allergies is also covered by that extra fund to cover
Mhm.
our health insurance. And or practices such as that when we take our leave, we're respectful of each other's time off, that we don't actually expect them to respond to emails or work calls or
Mhm.
work related matters, but for them to fully take that time off and not to feel guilty about it. That
Yeah.
is basically part of what we should be recognized as a valid, need of a team member, and has to be absorbed within the way the resourcing of the organization is arranged, so that we have to think about how do we fill in that temporary absence, and not burden the person on leave to either feel guilty or to still be expected to continually check emails or respond to calls.
With that question, and you're thinking about how you practice feminist values,
Mm.
how do you think about
Um,
well-being and security within that? How have you conceptualized that in your work? Because I know that you've done some thinking around holistic security, and I'd love to hear a bit more about that for people to understand a bit about how you do that.
so for us, I mean, as you said, so we give security and well-being grant to activists at risk, to women and LBTI activists at risk. So that's our main, one of our main programs. But as we said, we have to walk our talk, and we have to also practice it within the organization. So we have specifically allocated funding and have asked that, especially those teams that processes a rapid response grant, that they could take avail of consultations with psychosocial counselors for their debriefing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically part of how they have to be supported, uh, given the potential of secondary trauma in this type of work.
Yeah.
However, I mean, none of the team members have taken that
Okay.
um, uh, that offer. So none of them have actually gone out to consult with psychosocial counselors. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not so sure why there are no takers as of yet. Possibly because there's just too much work, so people
Mm-hmm.
don't have time for it. But I think this is it. I think because even as we were so intentional about creating a different organization and trying to put in practices, including putting up and center a learning question to guide us to change the culture of our work and work environment. It's so easy to get into the default way of doing things, of how we're so used to overworking ourselves, of putting ourselves last, of thinking that these types of practices are privilege more than a necessity. So, in that context, then, it's not easy to make this change and to embody the change that you want to see, because when you yourself are questioning the validity of such intention,
Mm-hmm.
so, and how it plays out, in your everyday life. So I think that's where we are caught at the moment in terms of how we're progressing, that we have been very intentional. We try to put in practices, but it's our own way, our own ways of being, our internalized ways of being and doing, that we actually have to interrogate and be more conscious of and be more mindful of in terms of changing, so that then it also cascades into organizational and movement-wide changes. Yeah.
It's such an interesting observation that even when you're intentional, there's still that personal resistance to basically behaving differently, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like coming up in you even when you make those decisions. Given that, I wonder, does it still feel worth doing? Like, do you still at the vision level feel like it's
Mm-hmm.
important?
Yeah, and I think the resistance is not intentional. Or my sense is it's more of because most of the way we've operated now has become so normalized and become, part of the subconscious really of the movement,
Mhm.
and therefore we haven't uh, deliberately surfaced it, talked about it, and collectively address it. So the resistance is not something that because we don't want it, but because we're just not conscious that we're falling yet again to our default ways of doing things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So we
yeah,
have to be more overt and deliberate about surfacing these practices that we want to change before we can even begin to change them.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's like, first of all, you have to surface the problems that that are still happening, right? The ways in which you're still
Yes.
finding that it hard and resisting. Right, right. Um,
Yes. Exactly. Be
yeah.
a little bit more self-reflective and self-aware, and start from there, in terms of what then do you have to consciously and mindfully do or change in your daily work practice, so that you get to a place where it becomes more wholesome, uh, health wise, spiritual wise, and in fulfilling in other dimensions of your
Mhm.
life. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder, how do you see that playing out in the organizations you fund, given that you're funding organizations that
Mm-hmm.
might have similar challenges?
And it's actually, I mean, a big challenge for organizations that we interact with and eventually become our grantees, because one of the current reality is many of these organizations don't even have money to run their own programs and activities. So what happens then is that basically they do their activism, or they service the movement by exploiting themselves,
Yeah.
because there's so little resources. Much of these resources is being used to run the activities that they need to do to be able to address the issues that they are concerned with. And then only if there's any left, or if there's none left, would they think about their own safety and security and well-being. So it's always the last item in the budget, if it even covers it, or it's basically just completely sacrificed and and considered non-essential. So basically, because this need has been externalized, it's been left to grant-making organizations like us that support activists at risk to respond to this need, instead of it being integral to how resources are allocated within each organization in the movement.
Yeah. And so to try and challenge that, what, on a more structural level, I guess I'm interested in what
Mm.
you think might need to happen to funding streams more generally in order to, I don't know if there's anything
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
we can think about
Yes.
on a more structural level.
I mean, that's been the call for several years now, if not for a decade, of many of the funding organizations, including women's funds like us, that basically um, funders, they only fund the projects, but they don't fund the people
Yeah.
implementing those projects. Meaning they don't give them enough funds to be able to have proper benefits. And these benefits are not even, you're not asking for the sky. You're basically asking for basic right to work
Yeah.
benefits. I mean, that's integral to what a right to work is. So that they're able to respond to give funds for that. So the funders have to think that, I mean, these programs don't run on their own. There's basically warm bodies who are sacrificing or exploiting themselves to run it. They don't fund properly, so for these warm bodies to be able to respond to their own personal needs.
Yeah.
So definitely to get outside of project funding is critical if we want to structurally change this practice in the organization.
Mm-hmm. Get outside of project funding, and
Yes.
and then in terms of how we think about our work, or how people in movements think about of what it is to be an activist, and this, I guess that's the individual thing that comes up of the, like this, we're so used to exploiting ourselves to
Mm-hmm.
do the work, like
Mm-hmm.
I think you've already said it's about surfacing that fact that we're exploiting ourselves, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And then and you've already said that you've learned that that's a journey. It's not like you see it and then you solve it, right?
Mm-hmm. 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 Totally, yes, yeah. It can be done overnight. Yes.
No.
Yeah.
What are there a few things that you say have helped you shift? You talked about the learning question, but then you talked about the provision
Mm.
of the counselling that people weren't taking up. Are there any other
Mm.
strategies, I
Mm.
don't know, around the security stuff or the well-being stuff that you've seen work in organisations?
Yeah, the other thing which I think is also crucial, but we also don't talk about it as much, is for me, I mean, is being more intentional and about relationship building, I think. And for us, it's been a big challenge because that's not easy in a virtual office like ours, wherein we're working with a multicultural team. So, um, but for me, part of well-being is basically, it's like building a close friends with the people you work with, so that there be less misunderstanding and miscommunications
Mm-hmm.
uh, across. But for myself, personally, I find it so difficult because my sense is the way I build relationships is not through Facebook or Twitter or any of the social media platforms. I mean, the way I build relationship is basically I relate, face to face with a person and have in-depth exchanges and even shared experiences with these people. And then only then are you able to build the trust and relationship that's strong enough to be able to navigate linguistic and communication challenges, and also being able to navigate some of the differences in perspectives and personal styles of working.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I mean, that's one of the challenge that I feel we need to think about. And it's not easy because sometimes when we think about well-being, we think about it more in terms of psychosocial support or having breaks and rest and respite. But for me, I mean, I think it should also include having healthier and more robust and more and and relationships of empathy with each other. And I
Yeah.
think that has to also be part of it, and we should find ways to address that too.
Mm. Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm going to end the conversation here because of the technical
Yeah, no, because I was
challenges.
thinking about it. We were
Carry
Yeah,
on, carry
I
on.
was this we were discussing about it because I mean, I was just before I came here last night, I was in a meeting with one of my fellow activists in the Philippine movement, and they've been under great stress because there's just a targeted attacks against them and their networks. And then we're trying to support them develop webs of safety and care, which is basically one of our programs of developing systems of support and protection for activists that is embedded in their communities instead of just depending reactively on our rapid response grants after a risk has happened. So if they're able to build the systems of support and protection uh, pre before these risks intensify, then don't have to be too dependent on our grants. So when we were talking about it, and one of their key needs is again around psychosocial support. And then basically they have organized quick reaction teams every time there's an arrest or a raid that happens in their network. And yet they haven't factored in uh, sessions of debriefing and working through the emotional uh, labor that's involved in doing this work. But then when we were discussing it, it wasn't, our conversation turned not so much in terms of having the psychosocial support to address mental health, but more for them, it was basically how do we deepen, how do we have this debriefing so that we're deepening our relationships with each other so they don't break even in the context of highly repressive situations. So it wasn't to address a mental issue, but rather to deepen a relationship that is part of how they sustain their network amidst this political repression. So I think that's also relevant to think about that in organizations like us, even if we're not directly under attack as they are. But I think other organizations could benefit from that insight as well of deepening relationships within each organization.
Yeah, it feels like if you have deeper relationships, you're able to withstand and support each other in a deeper way that will then help to maybe prevent some problems and maintain support over time, right?
Yeah, and I think it's the other side of what I earlier talked about, because when you're talking about what are the structural changes that we need to put in place, and I talk about changing the funding stream so that it's not so focused in terms of projects, but the other aspect of that is also putting value to the intangibles that as critical to building and sustaining movements. And for me, that is about building relationships and trust. And we don't value that as much as we try to value looking for money and funding, monetarily our initiatives. Because as you were saying, I mean, deepening this relationship sometimes would be the thread that would hold you together much more than just the funding, in difficult situations such as, politically repressive governments attacking activists.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing for people to think about how they can orient towards relationship rather than just streams of money, right?
And it doesn't have to be either or. It can be both. But I think the way we've run it so far is we've overvalued trying to look for funds and resourcing through funds most of our movement initiatives, when actually part of what built it in the first place was basically friends and colleagues and comrades having a shared vision of of social change and committing themselves personally and professionally to pursue that. And it's that intangible commitment that's deepened, by friendships and relationships that, upholds, I mean, that keeps this movement alive, and but also creates the challenges for it. But because, as you well know, when personal relationships don't work, within organizations and movements, it's also part of how it becomes challenging for many of us, how we define who do we work with and why do we work with or not work with a certain person or groups of person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love that. So I'm gonna draw our call to a close because I know we've had a few technical challenges, and I want to quit while we were ahead rather than.
Okay, go.
So I think thank you so much. It's been really interesting to hear about how you conceptualize some of this stuff in your practice at Urgent Action Fund Asia and Pacific, and we'll look forward to hearing how that. I'll definitely look forward to hearing how the learning question structure for reflecting on how you're doing things internally goes, because I think it's a really interesting approach. So thank you so much for sharing that and for being with us today. And have a great rest of your day, great retreat.
Yes. And then I would have to share more. I could share more after the retreat when we actually we actually have a whole day on that learning question to reflect on. But yeah, but we will keep in touch. I mean,
let's do that,
and it will be better connections technically next time.
Thank you so much for being with me. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Yes. Okay. Bye. Have a good day.
You've been listening to me, Marianne Clements, in conversation with Mary J. Rial, and this is Healing Solidarity, Embodying Change, the second conference about reimagining international development. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. If you'd like to spend a little more time with the ideas and suggestions we discussed in this talk or in any of the others in this conference, don't forget you can make a contribution to support the production of this and get access to downloads of the recordings and resources to help you go deeper with these themes and ideas. Just click the link below this video to find out more.